Sarah had always been a light sleeper, but lately something was keeping her awake at night. It wasn't the usual sounds of the old house settling or the wind rattling the windows. It was the phone calls. They started 3 weeks ago, always at exactly 3:17 a.m. The phone would ring once, twice, then stop. When she'd check the caller ID, it would show nothing but static lines. At first, she thought it was a prank, teenagers maybe, or a glitch in the phone system. But the calls were too precise, too consistent to be random. Sarah lived alone in the Victorian house she'd inherited from her grandmother. The place had character, her realtor had said. But Sarah was beginning to think it had too much character. The house creaked and groaned like an old ship in a storm. Sometimes she'd hear footsteps in the attic, but she'd convinced herself it was just the house expanding and contracting. But the phone calls were real. They were deliberate, and they were getting longer. Last night, the phone had rung 15 times before stopping. Sarah had counted each ring, her heart pounding harder with every shrill tone. She'd tried unplugging the phone, but somehow it still managed to ring. The sound seemed to come from within the walls themselves, echoing through the empty rooms like a ghostly summons. Sarah worked as a freelance graphic designer, which meant she could work from anywhere. She'd chosen this house because it was cheap and isolated, perfect for focusing on her projects. Now, the isolation felt less like a blessing and more like a curse. The nearest neighbor was Mrs. Henderson, a widow who lived half a mile down the winding country road. Sarah had met her once at the mailbox, a frail woman with knowing eyes. "That house has stories," Mrs. Henderson had said, glancing up at Sarah's Victorian with something that looked like pity. "Not all of them have happy endings." Sarah had laughed it off then, but now those words echoed in her mind every time the phone rang. She'd done some research on the house's history. Built in 1889 by a wealthy businessman named Thomas Crane, it had housed 5 generations of the Crane family. The last occupant before Sarah's grandmother had been Margaret Crane, Thomas's great-granddaughter. She'd lived alone in the house for 30 years before dying of natural causes in 1987, or so the official records claimed. Sarah found old newspaper clippings that told a different story. Margaret Crane had been found dead at the bottom of the stairs, the phone receiver clutched in her hand. The article mentioned that neighbors had reported hearing the phone ringing incessantly the night she died. When police arrived, the phone was off the hook, producing only static. Sarah tried to push these thoughts away, but as 3 a.m. approached each night, she found herself staring at the phone with growing dread. Tonight was different. Tonight, Sarah decided she would answer. She sat in the living room, watching the grandfather clock in the corner tick toward 3:17. The house seemed to hold its breath, waiting. At exactly 3:17, the phone rang. Sarah's hand trembled as she reached for the receiver. She lifted it to her ear and whispered, "Hello."
Static filled the line, but beneath the white noise, she could hear something else. Breathing. Slow, labored breathing that seemed to come from very far away. "Who is this?" Sarah asked, her voice stronger now. The breathing stopped. For a moment, there was complete silence. Then a voice spoke, so faint she almost missed it. "Sarah." Her blood turned to ice. The voice was female, elderly, with a quality that suggested it was coming from somewhere beyond the reach of normal sound. "Who are you?" Sarah demanded. "Margaret," the voice whispered. "Margaret Crane." Sarah's grip tightened on the phone. This had to be a joke. Someone was playing a sick prank on her. "What do you want?" she asked. "To warn you." Margaret's voice drifted through the static like smoke. "He's coming back." "Who's coming back?" But the line went dead, leaving Sarah alone with the dial tone. She sat there for several minutes, trying to process what had just happened. It couldn't be real. Dead people don't make phone calls. But deep down, she knew what she'd heard wasn't human. The next day, Sarah drove to the local library to research more about the Crane family. What she found made her wish she'd never answered that call. Margaret Crane hadn't died alone. She'd been on the phone with the police when she fell, trying to report an intruder. The intruder was never found, but Margaret's final words, recorded by the emergency dispatcher, were chilling. "He's in the house. He's been calling me for weeks. Thomas is back." Thomas Crane, the original owner, had died in 1923 under mysterious circumstances. His business partner had accused him of embezzling funds, but Thomas had died before any charges could be filed. According to the records, Thomas had fallen down the same staircase where Margaret would die 64 years later. But the most disturbing detail was in Thomas's obituary. It mentioned that he'd been obsessed with a telephone, one of the first in the county to have one installed in his home. He'd reportedly spent hours each day making calls, even when no one was on the other end. Sarah drove home as the sun was setting, her mind racing with possibilities. Could the house somehow be replaying old events? Was she experiencing some kind of psychic echo? Or was something genuinely supernatural trying to communicate with her? That night, she didn't wait for the call. At 3:15, Sarah picked up the phone and dialed her own number from her cell phone. She wanted to test whether the phone could ring when she initiated the call. It worked normally, which meant the midnight calls were coming from outside the house. At 3:17, the phone rang as usual. This time, Sarah answered immediately. "Margaret, is that you?" "Sarah." The voice was clearer tonight, less distorted by static. "You have to leave tonight." "Why? What's going to happen?" "Thomas is getting stronger. The calls, they're how he finds his way back. Each time you answer, you give him more power." Sarah's hands were shaking. "This isn't real. You're not real." "I tried to ignore him too. For 30 years I lived in that house, and for 30 years he called. every night at 3:17, the time he died. But you answered. Finally, yes, and when I did, he came back, not as he was, but as something else, something hungry.
The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Sarah could see her breath forming small clouds in the air. What does he want? To live again. But he can't do it alone. He needs someone to invite him in. Someone to answer his calls and open the door between worlds. Sarah looked around the living room, suddenly aware of how many shadows the old house contained. Each dark corner seemed to pulse with potential threat. How do I stop him? You can't, but you can leave. Pack your things and go. Don't answer the phone again, ever. But this is my home now. Margaret's laugh was bitter and sad. It was my home too. Look how that ended. The line crackled with static, and Margaret's voice became fainter. He's coming. I can feel him getting closer. Sarah, you have to... The phone went dead. Sarah didn't sleep that night. She sat by the window, watching the driveway for any sign of movement. Every shadow seemed menacing, every sound amplified in the darkness. By morning, she'd made her decision. She would pack her essential belongings and find somewhere else to stay, at least until she could figure out what was happening. But as she was loading her car, Mrs. Henderson appeared at the end of the driveway. "Leaving so soon, dear?" the old woman asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "The house. There's something wrong with it." Mrs. Henderson nodded knowingly. "Margaret tried to leave too, you know, several times over the years, but Thomas always brought her back." Brought her back? Oh yes. You see, once you've answered his calls, you're connected to him. Part of his network, you might say. He can reach you anywhere. Sarah's heart sank. So, there's no escape? There might be one way, Mrs. Henderson said thoughtfully, but it's dangerous, and it requires you to stay in the house for one more night. Against every instinct screaming at her to leave, Sarah found herself asking, "What do I have to do?" Mrs. Henderson explained that Thomas's power came from the connection between the phone and the house. If Sarah could destroy the original phone line, the one installed when the house was built, it might sever his ability to call. The problem was finding the main connection point, which was likely hidden somewhere in the house's foundation. Margaret never found it, but she wasn't looking in the right place. Thomas was a clever man. He wouldn't have put something so important where it could be easily discovered. Sarah spent the day searching the house from top to bottom. She found old photographs of the Crane family, letters dating back to the 1890s, and even Thomas's original business ledgers. But she found no sign of the main telephone connection. As evening approached, Sarah realized she was running out of time. If Mrs. Henderson was right, and Thomas was getting stronger with each call, tonight might be her last chance to act. She decided to try a different approach. Instead of looking for the phone line, she would trace its path from the phone itself. Using a flashlight, Sarah followed the phone cord from the living room into the kitchen, then down into the basement. The basement was a maze of old pipes and electrical conduits, but she could see where the phone line separated from the others and disappeared into the foundation wall. Following the wall to its end, Sarah found herself in a small alcove she'd never noticed before. The space was barely large enough for a person to stand in, and it reeked of something old and rotten.
In the center of the alcove was a metal box, green with age and corrosion. Sarah opened it with trembling hands. Inside was a complex network of wires and connections, all leading to a single, ancient-looking device. It looked like something from the early days of telephone technology, all brass fittings and hand-wound coils. But there was something else in the box. A photograph, yellow with age, showing Thomas Crane standing next to the very phone in Sarah's living room. On the back of the photograph, someone had written in faded ink, "The first call is always the hardest. After that, it gets easier." Sarah heard the grandfather clock chiming upstairs. It was 3 a.m. She had 17 minutes. Working quickly, Sarah began disconnecting the wires. Some came apart easily, corroded by time and moisture. Others required more force, and she had to use a screwdriver she'd brought from upstairs. As she worked, she could swear she heard someone moving around in the house above her. Footsteps crossing the living room, pausing at the top of the basement stairs. The footsteps began descending. Sarah's heart hammered as she frantically pulled at the remaining connections. The device was more complex than it appeared, with wires leading in directions she couldn't follow in the dim light of her flashlight. The footsteps reached the basement floor. She could hear them moving through the maze of the basement, searching, getting closer to her hiding spot with each passing second. She grabbed the central component of the device and pulled. It came free with a shower of sparks and the smell of ozone. Immediately, the house fell silent. The footsteps stopped. The general hum of electrical activity that she'd never noticed before disappeared. Even the grandfather clock upstairs stopped ticking. Sarah waited in the alcove, barely daring to breathe. After what felt like hours, she crept out of the basement and back upstairs. The house felt different now, lighter somehow, as if a great weight had been lifted from its rafters. She looked at the phone in the living room. It sat silent and dark, finally just an ordinary piece of plastic and metal. Sarah didn't sleep that night, but for the first time in weeks, it was by choice rather than fear. When morning came, she called Mrs. Henderson to tell her what had happened. "You did it," the old woman said, and she could hear the relief in her voice. "Thomas is gone. Finally, truly gone." "How can you be sure?" "Because, dear, he's been calling me too. Ever since Margaret died, trying to find another way into that house. My phone went silent at exactly 3:17 this morning. I realized that Mrs. Henderson had been protecting me, taking some of Thomas's attention away from the house. She'd been a target too all these years. Why didn't you tell me? Would you have believed me? Sometimes people need to experience the impossible before they can accept it. Over the following weeks, Sarah's life returned to normal. She worked on her design projects, enjoyed the peace of the old house, and even began to appreciate its Victorian charm. But she never forgot the lesson she'd learned. Some connections once made are difficult to sever, and sometimes the dead don't want to stay buried. The phone remained disconnected, a silent reminder of the supernatural ordeal she'd survived. Months later, Sarah was cleaning out the attic when she found a trunk she'd never seen before. Inside were more photographs of the Crane family, along with Margaret's diary. The final entry, dated the night Margaret died, contained a chilling revelation. "I thought destroying the phone line would stop him," Margaret had written. "But Thomas was cleverer than I imagined. The phone was never the real connection. It was just a symbol, a focus for something much older and more powerful. The real connection is the house itself. It always has been." Sarah dropped the diary, her hand shaking. As if summoned by her fear, she heard a sound from downstairs, a sound she recognized but had hoped never to hear again. The phone was ringing. But that was impossible. She'd destroyed the connection months ago. The phone wasn't even plugged into the wall anymore. Sarah crept to the top of the stairs and looked down into the living room. The phone sat on its table, dark and silent, but the ringing continued, seeming to come from the walls themselves, just as it had before. She checked her watch. 3:17 a.m. Thomas Crane was calling again. And this time, Sarah realized there might be no way to make it stop. The ringing continued as Sarah stood frozen at the top of the stairs, understanding finally that some hauntings are woven into the very foundation of a place. Margaret's diary had been right. The house itself was the connection, and Sarah was now part of it. Forever. The ringing stopped, leaving only silence and the terrible certainty that tomorrow night, at exactly 3:17 a.m., it would begin again.